Welcome, everyone. Hello. Thank you all for coming to today's book talk with Ajay Singh Chaudhary, author of the remarkable new book, The Exhausted of the Earth, Politics in a Burning World. My name is John Smalley, and I'm a librarian with the Humanities Department of the San Francisco Public Library. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our community and to tell you about a couple upcoming programs. On behalf of the Public Library, we want to welcome you to the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place. As guests, we who reside in their traditional territory recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. One moment. Today's program is part of the library's month-long Everybody's Climate program series, a series that we hope will inspire you to take action for a safer, greener, and more sustainable future. I want to mention the final program in our series, which takes place this Wednesday, July 31st. This Wednesday in the main library's Latino room, you can enjoy an evening of deep listening and deep ecology with the acclaimed Left Coast Chamber Ensemble. This live chamber music concert explores compositions by composers whose music is connected to the earth and to the climate. I also want to mention that next Sunday, August 4th, also in the Latino room, actress Angelina Jongeres will be performing a dramatic reading of The Mask of Anarchy, a stirring poetic celebration of nonviolent resistance by the 19th century English Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. The performance is 25 minutes long and will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A. So this ends my announcements. I'll put the links to the programs just mentioned in the chat. Before introducing today's presenter, Ajay Singh Chaudhary, I want to ask audience members to please keep your microphones muted during the talk. If questions for the author come to mind while he's talking, please put your questions in the chat. And give me a moment here. When Ajay is finished discussing his book, we'll have time for a short Q&A period. I'll ask the author a few questions, and he will also be available to answer your questions. And let me try to bring the author on board here. There he is. Welcome.
Hi.
So as I was saying, when he's finished, I'll ask Ajay a few questions, and he'll be available to answer your questions. Now let me, before turning the microphone over to Ajay, I want to just say a few words about the book, its critical reception, and the author's biography. The book's publisher describes The Exhausted of the Earth with these words: climate change is not only about the exhaustion of the planet, it's about the exhaustion of so many of us, our lives, our worlds, even our minds. So what is to be done? To answer this question, Ajay Singh Chaudhary brings together both the science and the politics of climate change. He shows how a new politics, particular to the climate catastrophe, demands a bitter struggle between those attached to power, wealth, and security of business as usual, and all of us, those exhausted in every sense of the word by the status quo. Replacing Promethean, romantic, and apocalyptic fairy tales with a new story for every exhausted inhabitant of this exhausted world, The Exhausted of the Earth outlines the politics and the power needed to alter the course of our burning world far beyond and far better than mere survival. Now, The Exhausted of the Earth has been garnering great reviews. To cite just two examples, Raj Patel, the international best-selling author of The History of the World and Seven Cheap Things, says Chaudhary's book is, quote, destined to be a classic, a touchstone in global climate struggles to come. The exhaustion of the earth is a gift to a world burning to learn, unquote. Also, the noted environmental journalist and activist Bill McKibben describes The Exhausted Earth as, quote, an important book about why business as usual is not going to get us out of the climate crisis, and indeed why any progress will require people to stand up to that business as usual in new large-scale ways, unquote. And now a few words about today's author. Ajay Singh Chaudhary is the executive director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and a core faculty member specializing in social and political theory. He's written for The Guardian, The Nation, The Baffler, N+1, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. It is my great honor to welcome Ajay to our program. I'm now turning the microphone over to him. Please do put questions you have for him in the chat, and we'll address those in the Q&A afterwards.
All right. Thank you so much, John. And I want to thank John and Paula and everyone at the San Francisco Public Library who's working on this series for inviting me to talk to you all. It's an honor. And I'm looking forward to what questions people will have. I'll try not to be too long in my opening bit. What I often like to do when I'm talking about this book, when I'm presenting it for folks for the first time, is read a little bit from the prologue and then sort of gesture out at some of the bigger themes that are coming along the way. So I'll do that exactly now. So the story goes. When I first started writing this book, I won't tell you exactly when, but let's just say atmospheric carbon concentration hovered at a mere 400 parts per million. I was fairly confident I knew what I was going to argue, some of which still holds. Climate change is inherently political. Climate change forces temporal pressures that are fundamentally at odds with, well, what most people think of as politics or political theory. And it is vital for the politics of climate change to be far more informed, far more synthesized with the genuinely unprecedented world that was being outlined in ever greater detail through the climate sciences. However, as I started to actually do that, really dig in past other people's work, past headline claims, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC policymaker statements, news summaries, etc., I realized I needed to go to drastically change course. That original story hinged on technologies I discovered were deeply oversold, on biophysical problems I hadn't yet encountered, and temporal pressures that make me embarrassed at the length of time writing this has taken. It really did take a very long time. If this were, let's say 1977, not that long ago, but still, perhaps some incrementalist nudge and investment program might have partially worked, at least for some of the most important aspects of climate mitigation and adaptation. I'll skip this a little bit. A more aggressive, radical, but still systemically conservative plan might have done more. But it's 2023 now, it's 2024. And that hasn't been the case for some time now. A lot of what I'm going to tell you about descriptively and prescriptively is significantly more brutal, as there's no magical way to simply roll back the clock. Since we can't, let me tell you the approximately 420 parts per million story. And it's very funny because that number is now no longer accurate, even though it was back when I published this, which was less than a year ago. Climate change is not some nebulous impersonal abstraction, an unfortunate phenomenon we all come together and finally solve. Climate change is political, not the imaginary politics of universal consensus or the anti-politics of miraculous technological salvation, and no, not the end of the world. The politics of climate change is a struggle between actually existing people over actually existing crises with actually existing differences, interests, and prospects. Climate change is about power. Not only the power generated in turbines or the increased kinetic energy, one of the more elegant ways to describe global warming, coursing through the Earth's systems, it is the power of socioeconomic forces to shape our ecological niche, the power within those systems to change political systems, and the potential political power to alter the course of our burning world and knit together something unanticipated, something better instead. So here's where I come clean, I suppose. Maybe you were tipped off by the title of this book, paraphrasing one of the best-known anti-colonial thinkers of the 20th century, the Afro-Caribbean psychologist and political theorist Frantz Fanon, or by the fact that the Critical Education and Research Institute I founded in 2012, Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, BISR, is literally named after the Frankfurt School. Yes, I think someone's head just exploded at the Federalist Society. So yes, I am on the political left. I am a Marxist, albeit a heterodox one. So you're going to hear about capitalism and how it is causally interrelated to climate change and climate politics. But I want to add that I came to these analyses honestly and share them with many who had quite different starting points. It would be a source of tremendous comfort if genuine climate mitigation and adaptation were possible within capitalism as we know it. And I mean that, right? If that were the case, I would be thrilled, right? If this could be solved within the systems as we have them now. One of the things I discovered over the long course of this project is how climate change makes for unlikely bedfellows, analytically and often politically. For those who start investigating climate from any angle with little more than the most mundane utilitarian assumptions, maximizing benefit for the largest number of people possible. I've seen some apolitical natural scientists become fire-breathing socialists in what seems like no time at all. Business school professors, finance journalists, and the occasional banker quietly transform from Milton Friedman to Rosa Luxemburg. Okay, maybe not quite that far. But yes, even some dyed-in-the-wool capitalists have become begrudgingly skeptical of the free market's ecology. And at the same time, I'm not actually making the case that within the very pressing time frame, and I cannot stress this enough how important time is for this story, we should be aiming for a classless society or the abolition of all private property. Don't get me wrong, I would love those things. I just don't think they're coming that fast. Climate politics is radical, unprecedented, but in some ways lateral to many conventional categories. I've also noticed how many specific issues, time again, for example, render certain hot button policy debates largely moot. I critically assess a host of technologies in the third chapter, but also some of the headline cases right now. Carbon dioxide removal technologies are a hot topic, they still are, don't really actually matter all that much. Time is so pressing for climate mitigation and adaptation that serious researchers and organizations who are confident in such technologies' potential realistically don't see them playing any role until after a near total energy transition, even in what we call hard to abate sectors. And as you'll read, you find people using every statistical or econometric trick there is, from shiny but obfuscating data visualizations to smuggling unfound assumptions into economic models and measures. I am not a science doctor, to borrow a joke from my colleague and BISR co-founder Abby Kluchin, but I take scientist research seriously. This project has required learning much I didn't know and asking for collegial help in understanding what I could not. In the course of it, I've done my best at adjusting the key elements of a few thousand or so natural scientific papers. While I'm a political theorist, I've long had an interest in the natural sciences and knew I wanted to work on climate change in one way or another. Last night, my mother, this was now a year ago, an actual science doctor, sent me a clipping I wrote on energy policy. Not particularly good. In the fifth grade, this is like my most mom thing that could ever be a mom thing, right? That said, I beg the forgiveness of anyone whose research I've misread. Another thing I've discovered trying to write this comprehensively about the topic is at some point you just have to give up adding new dimensions and updating to the latest data, changing practically daily. I was thinking about this earlier today as I was watching coverage. You guys were mostly on the West Coast, I'm assuming, of the fires. I opened my book talking about fires in California, but they are fires from 5 years ago. So literally you can never keep, this stuff is happening so fast and so quickly and so intensely, it's impossible to keep up. I am, though, above all else, not every bit of a chapter is perfectly up to date, etc., etc. I am, though, above all else, a teacher. I do a fair bit of administration too. That's an understatement. I've had the good fortune to teach material related to this book to waitresses and writers, coders and garbage men, electricians, and yeah, some ecologists. And I've done political work from the most mundane volunteering to working on formal elections to advising all kinds of organizations. I genuinely believe this has sharpened the arguments immensely, giving me windows onto a wide range of concerns and experiences that one doesn't always encounter. About now, you're probably wondering where the requisite mind-boggling fact dump or staggering summary introduction is. The answer is simple. I'm not going to do it. I don't feel the need to frighten or bolster you. I'm neither a doomer nor a cheery climate optimist. I'm a radical climate realist. What I mean by that, you can read about in the first chapter, but maybe we'll talk about it in the Q&A. Each chapter begins with or contains an illustrative narrative and proceeds to walk through the larger case in detail. In fact, there are almost 2 books in this book. The main text, which is, you can actually see it physically. It's fun. It's a good little demonstration. This is the like text. And then this is the second book. These are all the long notes and commentaries. In fact, there are almost 2 books in this book. The main text presents the full argument, the who's, the what's, the how's, and when's of a climate politics with the most pertinent direct details. There is also a fairly extensive notes section filled with a lot more than citations. Early on, I considered some kind of avant-garde presentation where the longer notes would constitute a shorter parallel text full of details and commentaries, which would appear right below. This really appeals to the part of me that loves like radical art and stuff. In this way, to use an example from the first chapter, while one is reading about economic facts like the extraordinary relatively recent rise in foreign direct investment, or in the use of tax havens in terms of climate politics, one could glance down and read a parallel story about how such phenomena, so seemingly distant from ecology and climate, are actually, even within cautious mainstream natural scientific research, connected to the accelerating rise of greenhouse gases or of biodiversity loss, respectively. However, in the end, and with the prudent guidance of my editors, these are now in easily accessible endnotes. I'm going to skip the rest of it. Okay. The first chapter, We're Not in This Together, is the basic outline that sets up the political argument. The politics of climate change are not about denial. We can talk about that more later if people want, or about extinction. I mean, that is a possibility, but it's not really the one that we're facing right now. But essentially 2 different speeds that define 2 different irreconcilable visions. In addition to introducing a number of lineaments, chapter 1 sets up the concept of right-wing climate realism, a broad spectrum of positions that favor slower climate mitigation adaptation in rather ordinary terms, all the way to the fringes of climate barbarism and beyond to preserve or enhance existing wealth and power aboard a hierarchical exclusive armed lifeboat. Here we are talking about the wonderfully apt phrase, business as usual, not in the sense of doing nothing, but of current trajectories as reflected in everything from the policies and practices of firms and governments to those in international political economy, treaties, and institutions. Far from the picture of climate denialism or a suicidal annihilation, we see this, is horrifying as it might sound, a perfectly rational and realistic wager. And in this part of the book, I talk about everything from like pretty like mundane things like insurance policies up to pretty hardcore things like border policies, internments, et cetera, warfare. Because these things are often discussed sort of separate from climate, but in fact, there's almost no issue in which these kinds of right-wing responses cannot be understood as part of, in fact, a quite realistic climate politics, just not one that we normally think about when we think about climate politics. In dramatic terms, I put this for every chapter of the book. I think of it as a story, essentially. Think of this as the antagonist, right-wing climate realism. If you're an eco-fascist or on that spectrum, you've purchased the wrong book. I'm sorry, all sales are final. I guess at the library you can return it, but hoping there are no eco-fascists reading my book. The second chapter, The Extractive Circuit, describes what is often euphemistically described in climate sciences, climate science literatures as the dominant global socioeconomic system. That's a quote from a very famous paper. They don't say capitalism because that would be too hot button. So instead they say the dominant global socioeconomic system, but that's capitalism. In a full socio-ecological portrait, we trace lines on the circuit through specific people, production, and consumption processes, and through sites and zones of metabolism, extraction, and exhaustion. It's a contemporary and historical portrait. It is a picture of what capitalism really is. And in this part of the book, I use sort of these two semi-fictional, they're not actually all that fictional, people who, would in fact be your neighbors, right? I use a sort of fictional middle-class coder or an office worker, and she works probably in the Bay Area or something like that. And I also talk about a domestic worker who she theoretically employs through through an app on her phone to cover what used to be called her second shift, right? And talk about these kinds of economic processes, the ecological context, but also the psychological and social repercussions, and just how misery is generated for both people in this system. And as we get larger and larger and we look geopolitically and geospatially across the world, we see just how much churning and destruction is required just to keep the global productivity growth rate and profits margins a little bit bigger, a little bit higher. It is a picture of capitalism. Really, we begin to see the difficulty of pricing in the externalities. In the simplest sense of mainstream economics, methods for moving currently unpriced free natural resources and sinks back onto firm ledgers, and consider its multiple confounding characteristics in social and ecological terms. A few dimensions are highlighted that I have found often absent in many literatures, in particular the qualities of increased speed and acceleration in a vicious cycle across socio-ecological metabolism. It just gets worse and worse. In dramatic terms, think of this as the setting. The third chapter, Climate Lysenkoism, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Rescue Class Analysis, discusses the subordination of concrete material conditions to ahistorical, naive, and often silly theoretical abstraction, i.e. climate Lysenkoism, using two examples from the Anglophone self-described left. In reality, there's nothing left at all about such cases, which have more in common with and indeed indirectly support eco-modernist tech magnates like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, or Elon Musk. I almost didn't write this chapter, but I found it in many ways unavoidable, and it's ironically the longest in the book. It also ends with a really fun second sort of half on utopias, on what we could have, on the technologies we do have. However, addressing a reactionary tendency, sadly too present in the global north, gives us the opportunity to review a range of climate technologies and policies and political histories. In doing so, we get to introduce theories of political affect, that is, the emotions and passions that play out in political life, and quote unquote, the minor paradise of sustainable niche. This concept of a minor paradise is something I borrow from my colleague, Rebecca Ariel Port. An outline of radical possibilities, not a utopian blueprint of what a world turned away from the extractive circuit can be. In dramatic terms, think of this as Act 2. The fourth chapter, The Exhausted of the Earth, introduces us to, well, the exhausted, the potential mass or stretched, adapting Fanon's language, class subject of left-wing climate realism. This chapter takes us from the negative ideal of individualized resilience through all the dimensions of exhaustion to discussions of actually existing climate movements, specific histories, and strategies the world over. This allows us finally to see not only where actual movements already are, and I will just say that there's a lot more sort of, not just more intense, but also broad-based climate movements in the global South than there are in the global North, something we'll probably talk about more, I assume, in Q&A. This allows us finally to see not only where actual movements already are and the difficulties they face, but to theorize the mass subjectivity primed through the extractive circus, right? What kinds of things are we already looking for? Are we already seeing? Are we already questioning? Are we already angry or happy about, and so on and so forth? Prime theory, possible modes of organization and strategies and tactics scaled to the daunting realities of climate mitigation adaptation. The already existing power of right-wing climate realism. Again, this is the not just a potential I see the way some people will write about ecofascism, which is also something I think is deeply possible. But this is policies and actions already in place right now that are already in power. And historical comparisons of how such radical transformations on the scale of what's described in much climate literature have taken place and how they might take place now. Here I'll just mention an example I use in that fourth chapter quite a bit, which is that the kinds of scale of economic and social change that we are talking about when people are talking about what is needed to sort of meet something even remotely approximating Paris Climate Treaty goals, right? There's already a debate about whether Delta 1.5 Celsius has already passed and what we're going to do about 2. But if we're going to hold even remotely close to that, the amount of money, the amount of stranded assets, the amount of wealth destruction, the amount of wealth transfer would be the only equivalent in human history would be the end of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery abolition here in the United States. And as you all can probably imagine, that's both a very expensive and also a very intense, to put it mildly, conflict that involves every kind of political strategy and tactic that you can possibly think of. In between meaningless reform and impossible revolution, we find mixed existing historical trends, historical models of formal state, civil, and guerrilla strategies. Thinking with Fanon, we address layers of global colonization and the corrosive, tragic, and yet necessary brutality and affective charge of what a left-wing climate realism entails. In dramatic terms, the exhausted is our protagonist and is, as you may already start to see, or I hope you see, potentially you. Finally, the fifth and concluding chapter, The Long Now, is a meditation on how fundamentally climate change alters time. I won't give a lot about this. I'll just say this one's for the real theory heads, but also contains a second sort of what I hope is a convincing discussion of the aesthetic possibilities and the way ordinary life can be really radically wonderful in a sustainable way, not just this kind of miserable asceticism, nor this kind of ultra consumerist, like robots are making toothpaste like in a billion flavors all the time, but actually something realistic, but also really exciting and wild. In dramatic terms, think of this as our denouement. And this is the story I am telling you. It may not be the prettiest, but it does have the virtue, as close as I can judge, of being true. The great critical theorist Walter Benjamin once argued that storytelling, today this is a much abused term, is the way in which people can relate, record, and intermingle personal and social experience, passing the story along ever so slightly augmented. My hope is that you recognize yourself along the extractive circuit, among the exhausted, that you already find yourself in a part of its potential international formation, and that you pass your story of exhaustion on to others who will share theirs, who will build and struggle and fight at your side for a flourishing earth, for a better life, while it's still possible. Time is short and politics immediate and urgent in a burning world. And at that, I think I'll stop my short little reading and invite John and everyone back in to ask questions, pose comments, etc.
Thank you, Ajay. That was a wonderful reading of the first part of your book. And I just want to say I found your book a really masterful synthesis of political theory, economics, climate science, and psychology. Although many of the things you discuss have been treated separately by other authors, your book is really an impressive, memorable, inspired, and inspiring synthesis. Before taking questions from the audience, I'd like to start with a couple general questions for you. And if you're agreeable, I also have more specific questions that came up for me as I read individual chapters. So to just start off in a sort of general fashion, when did you first become interested in the climate crisis?
I mean, it's funny. As I mentioned there, I wasn't lying. This stuff has been on my mind since I was a child. I was born in 1980. both my parents and my eldest sister, we're a very, very sciencey family. So both my parents have natural scientific training. My eldest sister is a computer scientist and also a composer. And we were just always around this kind of material. And I have been working on all kinds of different topics. In fact, my first, so like that's always been percolating in the back of my head. Interestingly enough, when I got into like graduate school and things like that, I was really mostly interested in that time in that project on the intersection of politics and religion. Which ironically dumped me back into at the end of my dissertation work now, like 20 years ago, right? Into a world of where I ended this long thing about philosophy of science. And something I find very amusing in this book is that it is, in fact, as you said, right, and as I hoped it would be, a synthesis between political theory, natural science, and all kinds of other things. But it does end with quite a lot of sort of theological ideas because they pop up, right? Things about the apocalypse and things like this are suffused. Like we can't escape those kinds of words in talking about climate change. So in some ways, that is part of the story of why I wrote the book. And the other part is that when I was sort of beginning this work and or when I set out to begin this work and teach classes on it and to learn as much as I could, to me, inescapably, this is the sort of crucible of contemporary political struggle. And I think once you start studying climate stuff, it's hard not to look at almost everything through that lens. And that is, I think, in many ways what became the book, was sort of looking at everything through the way in which climate, as I argue here, like it's not just that, we need a politics to rise to the climate change. It's like climate actually fucks over. Sorry, I'm not the person that's actually can't. It let me rephrase that. Climate reshapes even the way we think about what politics and political theory are.
It was interesting what you brought up about your interest in religion, because the book does really touch on ultimate questions. And my second question was going to be what motivated you to write this book, but perhaps you just explained that.
Oh, whoops. Sorry.
That's okay. It sounds like you anticipated me. That's great. I have some more specific questions.
Sure.
And I'll just maybe roughly mimic the progression of your book. So the first chapter, which is called "We're Not in This Together," that's the title. This title, I would say, names an insight that you frequently return to in later chapters. And you point out that while some people may accept that sea levels are really rising, they themselves are betting on what you call an armed lifeboat model of the future. Could you say more about this? How should this insight influence how we think about climate change in the present moment, in the future? What are implications for government policies, insurance policies, political organizing?
Okay.
Whatever you feel like.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I'll be able to hit all those. But I will say this. Yes. And I'm also an obsessive about citing. So this phrase armed lifeboat, I have borrowed from Michael Parenti, even though I have a slightly different view of it. Partially because he thinks it's like impossible to last. And I've heard this from other folks too, at various talks and lectures I've given, things like this, seminars, etc. And I try to show in that book just how much horror humans have actually lived through and how much horror we live through right now. So people who are like, oh, that doesn't seem possible, it'll never work, I think are kind of fooling themselves with just how ugly human history has been and just how much we already are in the maelstrom of climate conflict. And I can give some examples because often things that are held up as really like forward thinking, good climate policy, like, hey, Jay, don't be like such a dick. That's okay. So I think about things like the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act clauses that are about climate. There's quite a number of them. But I look at something like that, I'm like, okay, some of this isn't so bad, but mostly it's being built along a very nationalist model. If I carry it out, it's very, very piecemeal and it's far too little. It's writing off not only huge swaths of the world, but frankly, huge swaths of this country as well. And so when I look at things like that, and some people say, oh, look, come on, man, that's all right. I look at that and I'm like, oh, so you're literally saying here's a disposable population. They can just die. So I'm look at the end of the book, I talk, for example, about these heat records that are now even being broken in places like Pakistan and other places, Central Asia, uh, Africa, so Central Africa, Arabian Peninsula, etc. All these places are completely off the charts. And so you're kind of just saying all those people can die, especially if you have predicated it on we are like Janet Yellen just finished this global tour, right? Telling people not to buy Chinese solar panels. And like I can almost understand this from a weird kind of national economic, national security, whatever like thing that she has in her head. But when I see that, all I see is I am willing to sacrifice billions of lives such so that American bottom lines can be a little better. And when I say American, I don't mean like the average person. In fact, I talk a lot in the book about median Americans, median American incomes, median American wealth, um, inequality and the trajectory of the global economy over the past 40, 50 years has so changed the landscape, even in a place like the United States, that you can barely even say anymore that people are actually enjoying or getting a lot of benefit out of this constant extraction, this constant destruction of and colonization of places in the global South.
Thanks for that. Your comments on surplus population certainly rings true in a place like California, and the Bay Area for that matter, with how homeless populations
Oh,
are
yes.
treated. And there was a book, Golden Gulag, about the prison
Oh,
industry
absolutely.
as
Ruthie
well.
Gilmore. Yeah, yeah. In fact, I borrow quite a bit from her language as well for that part. Disposable population, which is her definition of racism.
Yeah, thanks. So moving to chapter 2, which is titled The Extractive Circuit. This is a part that was very strong for me,
Thank you.
pages 47 to 51. At the start of this chapter, you give a very cogent and disturbing description of the world's, shall I say, really existing economy
Yeah,
as an extractive circuit, an ongoing accelerating process that extracts both materials and labor. And you give the example of a hypothetical healthcare worker in California.
yeah.
And would you mind just talking a little bit about this part of your book? Your example didn't seem particularly hypothetical to me. I've known many such workers in San
Yeah. And
Francisco.
I mentioned this up front in one of my asides from the
Yeah.
preface. Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you highlighted this, and I'm glad that it landed for you. This is in some ways the shortest chapter in the book, I think, actually. But I think it's the engine, right? The first one really lays out the basic case, right? What's the political divide, right? There's not a universal um come to Jesus moment coming for climate change. I think a lot of people are waiting for it. It's not coming, folks. And then the second chapter is like, well, how are things actually working? What are the causal relations? And there have been a lot of wonderful books on this subject. I draw on many of them. But what I try to add are as much empirical data and argumentation that I can from the natural scientific side. And then on the other side, a sort of a more emotional, psychological, or phenomenological a bit about how people live this. And it's funny that you said they're not hypothetical. It's right. I actually do think I have in mind specific types of people, even I will even say even some specific people. But I'm not an ethnographer, nor did I want to do survey work or anything like that for this part. And the fourth chapter, I consult tons of survey data, tons of public opinion polling, that kind of stuff. But here, I just wanted to show particularly how these two folks. So I talk again about the sort of middle class office worker, and she works late hours, right? And she's got one of these bad boys, right? And she theoretically uses it both to right. Theoretically, this is a consumption object. It's made in like 83 different places in the world, something like that. The vast majority of its ecological destruction happens in its production, right? So what if we think about a place like California, which is doing a slow but better than most energy transition, that's only 20, 10, 20% of the energy that goes into this, let alone the materials, which include things like cobalt from literal slave labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it's usually pretty crazy to think about, okay, slave labor, Democratic Republic of Congo. I've got this Filipina migrant who's moved to California to try to get, to send money back home for her family, and then a middle-class American worker. Usually in many political analyses, not just Marxist ones, these are considered completely different social types. And I don't want to overstate the case. These are very different people facing very different problems. But for climate politics, all of them are linked in through this extractive circuit in really obvious and demonstrable ways, and their lives are not good. Like, so even the person at the top of my little food chain there, right? Someone who's doing better than the American median, she's doing all right. But her actual life is not that much happier through a lot of this sort of enforced consumption, right? She doesn't necessarily want to buy a new phone all the time, right? Google and Apple, right? They shove in every couple of years an update that makes this thing die, right? So you have to buy a new one. I think there's very few people who genuinely want a new phone. They just want one that works and stop and won't break all the time. But nonetheless, right? This to me is the core, because so many different people, and I say this in that chapter as well. I could have told the story about truck drivers. I could have told the story about farmers and peasants. I could have told the story about all kinds of different kinds of, I talk about refugees. I talk about, right, all kinds of different human populations, who most of whom face the same enemies and the same challenges and the same, what I then later develop in the book, exhaustions with the system as it stands, that everyone else, like in the policy world and in, yeah, frankly, the wealthy and the political representation of the wealthy, are like, can't we have more of this world? And if there's one thing that I will say in my research I have come across in a pretty stark way, is that the vast majority of people in this work may not agree with me, but definitely do not like the way the world is right now.
Great points. Thank you. In your third chapter, which is entitled Climate Lysenkoism, it has an interesting resonance for me as a native California. So I would say California, the home of Silicon Valley, Lawrence Livermore Lab, Stanford, UC Berkeley, and social media giants more recently, like Facebook, has a sort of perennial optimism about technology and technological solutions. At earlier programs in our climate crisis series, audience members have asked, even today, about proposed technical solutions such as carbon capture, redesigned nuclear power plants, and geoengineering.
Well, fuck.
But
Okay.
as you point out in your book, we already have all the technology we need. Can you say a few words about that?
Absolutely. And it's funny, I got a chance, oh God, I want to say 4 months ago or so, to present this work alongside Malcolm Harris, who wrote a wonderful history of Palo Alto and Silicon Valley and California, if people are interested in that. But yes, I mean, one of the challenges, because also I'm also not a romantic, and I'm not, I guess, a traditional environmentalist in some sense. I mean, I like plants and birds and things, don't get me wrong. But like, I don't actually think for the politics part, I necessarily need to have a deep, abiding like love and of nature, and nor do I think it is either desirable nor possible for us all to go back to some kind of like idyllic pastoralism. It's funny because people will like throw this on like sort of visions of this on their Instagrams, and then there's whole industries that have been built up around it, and things like this, but it's mostly bullshit. The other, right, like we're not all going to go that way, but the other side is also bullshit, right? That, okay, there's a tech solution for everything. It's not an on-off switch. Some technology is great, other ones not so great. Other ones, they would be great, but we don't got them. The joke I always say to folks in these kinds of discussions is, if someone's like out there and they've got nuclear fusion in their back pocket, I really wish they would stop hiding it from the rest of us, because that would be pretty useful right about now. And a lot of the issues with technologies, I mean, I get into some pretty gnarly political stuff there, but I'll just say that in a more sort of plain way, a lot of them are just like oversold or underbaked. So you said someone was asking about carbon capture. I mean, carbon capture, as I said in when I was reading, but I may have been reading too fast and all this kind of stuff, like doesn't really do, like if you look at life cycle assessment surveys of carbon capture, what do we do with most carbon capture right now? We use it to do hydraulic fracking and other ways of increasing our fossil fuel extraction. So there's a certain kind of irony there. Two, this is one of the biggest ones with everything. You got to remember, everything you make costs something, and I don't just mean money. I mean materials. I mean waste, I mean pollution, right? So I got to make these devices. I got to ship them along. And then they don't really perform as well as they're supposed to. So in a lot of these life cycle assessment surveys, which by the way, come out of places, in particular places like China, India, and a few other places that would love, like these countries would love this shit to work. Because they're actually manufacturing much, much more stuff than we are, right? And what they find is actually like a regular ass modern coal plant will be less destructive than the one I hook up the carbon capture to. And like I said before, some of the world's most like committed proponents of this technology, but just who aren't on the payroll of ExxonMobil, will be like, yeah, this is for mop-up duty. This is for the last 10%. This is the last mile. This is the last bit after you've done the easy stuff. But we haven't done the easy stuff. The easy stuff is not that easy, but like essentially stuff that we already know in many ways how to do it in the big areas, right? So in my book, I talk really about 4 key sectors, right? Energy, transport, energy for manufacturing, which is complicated, energy, transport, manufacturing to a certain degree, agriculture, and I'm forgetting the other one. Housing and urban design, right? And if you can kind of get those things on board in a large number of places, you can still have a lot of market activity happening in a different kind of way with these sort of commanding heights sort of set at certain kinds of levels. And that's sort of one of the, I think, things that's hardest to grok. It's not so much, oh my God, I want no technology and I want to live. There's a joke paper I cite from these wonderful researchers in Europe, where they're like, look, everyone thinks we want you all to live in a cave. Let me tell you about this cave. It's got internet. It's got air. It's got heat. It's not so bad. It's got new clothes every year. It's got all kinds of cool stuff. So, and these are like the most committed degrowth scholars who ever were degrowth, right? So, and I have some criticism of degrowth, but I do really respect the way that those scholars are really committed to the biophysical realities. And at the same time, I actually think we can reclaim the concept of eco-modernism. And I try to do this, right? Because to me, the thing we call eco-modernism that I know gets a lot of play in the Bay and places like that, is neither very ecological nor very modernist, right? Unless you're like modernism to me is like experimentation. It's Kafka. It's weird, like old, yeah, like communist utopian planning. It's weird post-colonial dreams of music festivals and new design cap, right? It's cool and weird and fun and awesome. And I think a real eco-modernism is what I try to describe towards the end of that chapter.
Yeah, well, one of the things I really loved about that chapter is that you do suggest that our future life could look much better. And the proposition that we could create, if we want it enough, the phrase used earlier, the minor paradise, a minor paradise of a sustainable niche. I love that idea. Could you just say a little bit more about what you mean by that term, and how could a possible future somehow entail a positive gain in time and quality of life? And then is this not just another techno-mystical fantasy?
Oh, fun. Time Q. So that's a really fun question, actually, because I have to tell you, when I was writing that section, one of the things that I probably spent an ungodly amount of time, I hope my editors are not listening to this because it was more than I was supposed to, was making sure that the technologies I was citing were not fake. So for example, one of the most fun things I cite there is like the potential to replace a large amount of air freight and air travel with blimps. And there is a lot of this work being done, but I was like, dude, don't fall for your own error, right? Like make sure it's not completely like smoke up the ass. So I went and looked, and it's mostly real. So I was like, all right. And part of the game there, if I may use that word, is to avoid that. This is a classic Marxian move, right? Marx was very insistent that lefties not be utopians, in the sense of like, I will write you an exact diagram. People like Fourier kind of did this, although Marx had some respect for the utopians, and Fourier, he just himself thought it was a bad idea, right? But just think about it, like I draw you the picture of exactly how the world's going to work, and then right, it only makes sense for like me. I live in Queens, right? So it makes sense for like me and Queens and things like this. But then someone in, I don't know, Uzbekistan is like, what the fuck are you talking about, asshole? Like it doesn't work everywhere. It doesn't even work every part of the US. So things are going to be different. The other thing that is meant to happen in those sections is, in fact, to highlight everything we have lost, everything we have not done, every one of these projects. And so this is where I especially get into the like what were once sort of utopian ideas from from decolonizing states and things like this, right? From post-colonial states. And sadly, that were sort of lost in the rush to keep the extractive circuit going. So instead of it being like, okay, here's my beautiful vision of the world, don't get me wrong, I love beautiful visions of the world. People should have as many of them as they like. Instead, it's like, here's a bunch of things we could have. Here's a bunch of things that you should have that like would be awesome, but we don't because of keeping the extractive circuit going. And you mentioned one, I think that's really, really a total winner and lands usually extremely well and has a lot of good data to back it up, which is something like what I call temporal luxury. Although often this in just, if you want to think about this in pop terms, just think of the 4-day work week and things like this. Doesn't mean that there's no work. In fact, part of the logics at play is that probably a lot of people have to be doing different kinds of work, and we have to really rethink what we valorize in our societies and things of this nature. But overall, for example, one of the most cited cases is Cuba in between the fall of the Soviet Union and when they got relinked to the global economy, had to do things like agroecology and agroforestry, and in a sustainable way without very much oil. And one thing that was really surprising in this sort of interesting project that involved Cuban political planners, Cuban scientists, native peoples, sort of farmers and others, is that it turns out when they all sort of got their project off the ground, not only was it producing good food and producing more of it, it was requiring less labor hours, which was a real shocker. So this to me is like a really good example of the kind of thing that you could have and people seem to want, and that is really sustainable. And also, the last thing I'll say about this is, and this here again, I'll cite someone else because I think Kate Aronoff talks about this probably more than anyone else on earth. Like, it doesn't have to be this grand, fancy, like I love my like grand literary examples and musical examples and architectural examples and all this stuff. But like, it could just be hanging out on the beach and drinking a beer. That's not like, that's pretty sustainable. A lot of things that we consider enjoyable in life are in fact totally okay. And a lot of the things that we are told we enjoy in life aren't actually all that pleasant, nor are they good for our well-being or the well-being of our ecological niche.
Thanks. I love the fact that your book also cites, several studies that show, the economists have sort of game this out. What would it take for a decent living for every person on the planet? And yeah, it seems possible.
Oh yeah, I mean,
the question is, why aren't we doing it?
Well, power. The answer is boring, and it's politics and power. But yeah, people have done the math 100 different ways, and it depends how you slice it up. One of the things I love in that section is I use this study group from Europe and this study group from China, right? And they think of themselves as being diametrically opposed, but they end up proposing almost the exact same system.
It was striking. I agree. So you mentioned time. The next chapter, chapter 4, the exhausted of the earth. On page 177, you mention a German word, Zeitkrankheit. Is that a real word?
Yes,
What does it mean? How does it express what many of us are feeling?
I
And
love it.
do you think that the world fully appreciates the temporal dimension of the climate crisis?
Uh, no. Can I ask the last thing first?
Yeah.
I think the last one, no. And I don't even mean this as like a gotcha or as a like to punching bag some of my favorite targets, but like even amongst folks who really take climate very seriously, not now I'm not talking about activists and frontline people on the front line, stuff like this, but I mean people who are like, I am really committed, this is my issue. I actually push back on the like treating it as a policy issue, like as like a single blade of a policy portfolio, because it cuts right across them, right? Think about, we've already talked about border policy, transport, urban design, right? It's everything, right? It's not everything, but it feels that way, right? And I actually don't think a lot. I think still the example, I actually like Adam McKay, so I don't want to keep on bagging on his movie all the time. But that Don't Look Up movie is, to me, is the perfect example of what people don't understand about the temporal dimension. Because right, it's about some weird future event that's about to happen. It's for, it's a singular event, like one day you'll just be sitting there and you'll like watch fire fall from the sky and be like, oh, the climate has changed. I see. Whereas actually it's the sort of slow boil that you all are experiencing, I think, firsthand right now, as far as I can tell. So coming back to the beginning, then Zeitkrankheit is in fact a real word. It means, it roughly translates in literal terms to like the disease or the illness of the age of the time, right? This is the same kind. The Zeit here is the same as in like zeitgeist, right? That Hegelian thing, right? The sort of, right, what's in the air in a certain time, right? What's hot right now? What's in the zeitgeist? And when I encountered this word for the first time, it was in a academic compilation about burnout in places like Germany. And while burnout probably feels very prosaic and again very far from the climate crisis, part of my overall argument is all of our systems are running too hot. They're running too fast. And there's not just like a random reason. It's not human nature to want to overdo things. I don't buy those arguments. We're doing it because it's profitable. We're doing it because it generates large revenues, even though it's actually costing more and more stuff over time, right? So it's like, right, here's your like how much profit margin, or here's how much growth rate you can like kind of nudge out of this, but here's the curve of material throughput use. It's not decoupling, it's fucking shooting up through the moon. So in many ways, what you've isolated here is the core, and one of the core arguments I really wanted to make in this book, to be like, do you feel like things are running away from you? Because I am running for a global North audience, even though I'm writing so much about the global South. I'm like, do things feel too fast and too hard for you? There's a lot of people like you around the world. How and in what ways can people connect? And that's really what that chapter 4 is about. It's about local struggles, but it's also about pointing us towards, excuse me, international formations that are possible in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. And I cannot stress this enough. We are talking about a very short and pressed time horizon, which makes me feel sort of guilty because I'm talking all about like how much we need to like, we're aiming for a world of relief and respite and rest and relaxation and beauty and all these kinds of wonderful things. But to get there, I'm like, we have to move now. We have to move fast and we have to move hard.
Thanks for your answer. Yeah, I think burnout's become an international phenomenon.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I
Um,
cite, I think in the fourth
yes.
chapter, these examples of like things like depression and stress and anxiety, and how the levels actually are remarkably similar from like a place like the America to a place like the Philippines, and so on and so forth.
Indeed. Um, in your third chapter, Climate Lysenkoism, and the fifth chapter, The Long Now, I love the architectural examples that you cited. And I'm thinking specifically of, you cite a farming kindergarten in Vietnam,
Yeah.
there's greening in Singapore and Kampala, the biotope city in Vienna,
Hmm.
and cooling systems like India's Red Fort and Spain's Alhambra. Would
Hmm.
you like to talk about any of those?
Yeah, absolutely. Should I do the thing where I share some pictures or
You could
not?
share some pictures, yeah.
Yeah, I'll try that. Number two. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Oh, of course, now it's doing the whole thing. I just got back from Japan a month ago. So these slides were ones I had prepared for my Japanese audiences. Um, And some of what John was just mentioning from the book is visible here. So forget everything on the left side, although I'm happy to talk about nuclear and CFCs and whatever if people want them. But if you look at the top, sort of this pyramid of pictures I put here or whatever, that's the farming kindergarten that John mentioned. And one of the reasons I cite this example, uh, another really wonderful critic who I want to cite here is Kate Wagner, and she points out just how often this kind of like architectural beauty stuff is actually bullshit, and a lot of times it is. I chose this one and this particular architect from Vietnam because he's really aware of that. And in fact, he uses the not very plausible stuff that you can sell for a lot of money to rich people to fund the mass stuff that he can actually thinks is worthwhile for non-rich people. And in the farming kindergarten works. Like, right? It like the workers from the shoe factory, all their children go there. They do in fact produce enough produce to like eat mostly off of it. Everyone is in fact getting a good education there. It's walking distance, it's walkable. It's quite really quite remarkable. And that's just like one tiny thing, but I find it to be so telling because it is in fact tremendously beautiful. And some of these other plants. So if you're looking at that middle sort of picture just below the farming kindergarten, that's Uganda. That's Kampala. And it's not so much the greenery I would want people to notice, is that the greenery itself here is urban and peri-urban agriculture. And it actually produces, again, 30 something percent, I forget, I have to go back and look, of the food for the city.
I think you said
These
40%.
Oh, I don't have the exact number. I should just look up my own book, right? Yeah, 40%. So like this is not nothing to sneeze at. And part of the argument I have in this part of the book is we should be learning both from other parts of the world that are already facing much more severe climactic and what I call socio-ecological, impacts than we are in the global north right now. There's a ton of stuff to learn from folks like this, that and also from the past. So I use the example of the wind towers, of the water channels like in the Alhambra, but also the Mashrubeya in Yemen and Sana'a, Yemen, right? These really ornate, people probably have a picture of it in their brain, right? Or you've seen on the internet, these really ornate windows that used to belong to like aristocrats' houses, but now all kinds of people have them. And they are really wonderful in that they let enough light in that it's bright, but they also block enough light that it's cool. And if you put them in the right parts of the houses, they create a wind tunnel effect, and it's very cooling. And I actually cite some engineering studies from Africa, these are, I believe, from North and Central Africa, the studies I cite in that part of the book, that actually show that this kind of, depending on your climate, all kinds of stuff, you want to do one thing or you want to do the other. Is it dry? Is it humid? Right? These things are going to change. But nonetheless, these things can be as effective, but much less materially and energy intensive than, say, air conditioning or some forms of heating, and so on and so forth. And I like to throw them in there again as an example of all of the attempts in the climate space and in our current politics to say, I just want to do what we have now, but somehow sustainable, as opposed to thinking, opening up our political imaginations, opening up our social imaginations, and being like, we can have a way better world without using so much crap and without destroying so much stuff. So I also have here some what might seem frivolous examples. I got my blimp. I've got Stepanova's high fashion. This was in the early Soviet period before Stalin. People probably know this was a huge explosion of radical art and radical design in this period.
Varvara Stepanova.
Yeah, yeah. And then I've got my son Ra at the bottom, right? I talk about Charles Mingus in the book, right? Music has not been tapped out. Music doesn't go away. And I even talk, believe it or not, and I'm going to be talking more later this year with, on the bottom right, I've got a video game still with people, even in the digital space, even people who work on high technology art forms and media. There are ways to do this in more and less sustainable ways. So again, these are all things that we exist with right now. They are possible. We could have them. We could share them, but we don't get to because of our insistence on, and I might say our, it's not really our, I have to be honest, right? Because of the insistence from the powers that be, that this way of doing things, the way we do it now, is the only way. And if I could just cite one more example that's not here, think about this example from the pandemic. During the pandemic, I believe this was only in Europe, but I have to go back and check. European airlines ran empty, right? No one was moving. There was an actual lockdown, but there was some arcane law about the airstrip space, right? That if you didn't use it for Y amount of time, it like goes, you like lose it. It's like use it or lose it, right? And what's so funny to me about this is, of course, there could have just been like that law is abrogated for the next 2 years, please. But what did we do to keep up margins for the airlines, et cetera, all this kind of stuff? What did we do? We ran the airplanes empty. And this is one of the most destructive human activities that we can think of in terms of individual consumption.
Wow, thanks. Lots of thought-provoking examples. Thank you for sharing the visuals too.
Okay, let me take those down now, actually.
So I just have one last question for you. Do you have any further reading recommendations? I noticed that the title of your book alludes to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And are there other books by Fanon that you would recommend in conjunction with climate?
That's so funny.
And are there any books published in the last year or two?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and if folks
tell
are
us and put them in the chat.
No, it's so funny.
Your endnotes have lots of great
literature. It's like there's a lot of stuff.
I mean, that's a great place to go.
I mean, all the Fanon, I have it all on my desk right here. Towards the African Revolution, Black Skin, White Masks, Alienation and Freedom, Wretched. I mean, I love them all. Read them. They're good.
The library has a lot, so check our catalog.
Yeah.
San Francisco
and then
Public Library.
I cite a lot of the existing literature, people like Andreas Malm, people like Mackenzie Wark, people like Kai Bosworth, Kate Raworth, all kinds of Jason Moore, Raj Patel, who you read from before. But coming out this year, I would say two that are on the top of my list that I'm excited to read and that I hope people are actually organizing with are another from Andreas Malm, and I forget who his writing partner is, but it's called Overshoot, and I think is also on specifically the politics of this climate conjuncture. And then I think it's already out, but I haven't read it yet. But I cite several of her academic papers in my book, so I'm excited to read her book, which is Stefania Barca's. I want to say it's called Workers of the World Unite, but it has some eco twist, and now I've forgotten what it is.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We're going to look those up. We have time for just a few questions from the audience. One that was submitted over the chat has to do with some billionaires want to go into space, and
let them.
You've probably heard, and let the one we live on sink, burn, and crack up. Any thoughts on that?
Good riddance. No, look, if Elon wants to move to Mars, just go for it, bro. No one's stopping you. No, I mean, I have to admit, I wish I could be as jokey as I want to be. And sometimes people misinterpret my jokiness as that I don't take things seriously. I take them deathly seriously, trust me. Um, but yes, I wish these ideas weren't as popular as they are. Sort of ideas about that, like if we can't get space mining up and off the ground, right? We're fucked. Like we have one of my favorite anecdotes in the book is Jeff Bezos being like, oh yeah, we could all do it here on Earth, but it would be boring. You wouldn't like it. And so then he's like, and here's my space program. Let's go. So I don't find that very convincing. I'm not saying we should like never go to space or something like that, but the idea that this is a hyper compelling ecological case right now, that's insane. And again, if rich people want to self-exile themselves from Earth, the only thing I would suggest, and this is as in tune with John Locke as it is with Karl Marx, is that they have to leave their wealth behind and we'll take care of it for them.
Yeah, thanks for that. Anyone else, you can raise your hand or lift up your voice if you have a question for Ajay. You'll have to unmute yourself. Any questions for the audience? From the audience, I should say. We've been checking the chat.
Okay.
We only received one thus far.
So bad.
Well, it's your last chance. We do have
Oh, Leo. Hey, what's up, man?
Hey, Jay. Hey, how's it going?
How you doing?
I'm good. It's great to see you, and this is a great conversation. I would love to hear you talk about like nuclear, some of those sort of at the things that exist at the edge of the sort of climate movement and the technological solutions, techno-futurist, utopian vision.
Yeah, okay. Nuclear. Oh man, why is everyone so hepped on the nuclear? The thing about nuclear is that it's the most boring issue, actually. I mean, and I do set aside like security stuff, although I probably shouldn't, to be perfectly honest. But the reason I set it aside is that I think there's some other really obvious problems if you really start doing research in the space. So even organizations like the IEA that are really pretty hepped up on nuclear, just keep quietly dialing down the amount of nuclear that they foresee in their mix, to the point where it is in fact just like a maintenance rate. It's barely a building rate. And the reason for this is as follows. One, no one on Earth, including the countries that are the best at building large scale, high tech projects. So again, I usually use the example of China, right? Builds massive, large scale, high tech installations, infrastructure, plants, all kinds of stuff all the fucking time, has not yet figured out a way to make nuclear power plants very fast. And that furthermore, everyone looks at nuclear and says, oh my God, it's so clean. But that's a little bit of a mirage because of using 100-year time scale, right? So over 100 years, you look at nuclear, you look at fossil, and you look at like wind and solar, and nuclear looks fucking amazing. You're like, holy shit. That's because you're working over 100-year life cycle, right? It takes about 7 years or so more to build these things. So again, we're not getting them anytime soon. And all of their costs are up. Almost all the costs are up front, except for waste disposal, which also no one in that space wants to talk about. So you get this problem where you're like building out huge amounts of concrete, using huge amounts of water at the time right now when you can least afford to be building that kind of structure or using that much water. And by the way, there's a similar argument to be made in the AI space, I have to say, even though that might push some buttons for any folks in the Bay who do work on that kind of stuff. That we're seeing similar stuff even faster in that space, right? The amount of energy, the amount of water it takes right now to keep it running, make the idea, I've seen some people float it as this kind of like climate coordinator, like, oh, maybe it can do these things for us, and not with the way it is now. And almost everyone has given up on this stuff. And one of the reasons why I feel bad, if I was going to go back and change something about nuclear in the book, it would be to add more of the security stuff, because most of the new plants that are coming online in the world are coming online not for energy reasons, but for security reasons.
Thanks, Ajay. I think we have two more questions from the audience, and then we'll probably have to end it there. The first question is, what's your next book?
Oh, I think my wife would like me to be at home for a while and not writing a book, but no, I do know. I'm working in part a follow-up to this. But as much as we've talked, and John really pulled this out for me, and I have to appreciate that from you, John. The next book's on aesthetics, partially on really laying out the aesthetics that I talk about in this book. So, in fact, I recently did a podcast, Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, which I work at. We put out a podcast called "It's Not Easy Being Green Under Capitalism" from our pop cultural Marxism series. And part of that is talking about the sort of bullshit and non-bullshit ways that you can have sustainable aesthetics. But actually, that would be one part of a larger book project that would be updating arguments about aesthetics and politics that have been around for about 100 years to the present day. And I'm very, very excited about that.
That sounds fantastic. Well, actually, that kind of cues up the last question we have for you. From Eric, do you have any thoughts on solar punk or other art that might help us to formulate new ways of organizing society?
I have to admit, I am not, it's funny, Brooklyn Institute offers a solar punk course. Last time I taught my politics of climate change course, actually a ton of the students from that class went over to the solar punk class. Now, I have to admit, I'm not as familiar with that work as I would like to be, which is probably why I need to take, many months to catch up and, long time to do some research. But I will say that there are other examples that I can think of that maybe haven't coalesced even into movements or sort of proper nouns yet that make me very excited. So I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be talking to a bunch of game designers later this year, a couple different times. And I used to carry around as a prop like these little fascinating devices that are ultra low power, not very complicated, but also using examples from sort of mainstream mass media of how the thing that costs the most, the thing that requires the highest technology, the thing that is the most movie or the most game or the most whatever is no longer seems to line up with what, even again, by the most basic market structures, what people actually want. It doesn't actually seem to line up anymore. And that to me is a really exciting change, especially in these high-tech spaces where people are like, actually, I don't even know what to do with another teraflop of processing power. I actually think if we spent a little more time on art design, that would be better, right? These kinds of questions are part of the aesthetic quality of sustainability that I think is so important, because again, in my work, I teach adults, I talk to adults, I organize with adults. And when I hear, and I don't mean to this is not denigrating children, nor is it denigrating old people, but when you talk to working people about this stuff, mostly what they want to know is, wait, is my life going to get worse or my life going to get better? And my answer is, your life's going to get better. It's just going to get really different. And that's also fun and cool and exciting. And let's look at some examples of how it can be fun and cool and exciting.
Well, thank you, Ajay. That was a fabulous talk. And thank you for taking the time to answer all of our questions.
Oh, thank you.
Once again, the library carries the book. You can also order it online. It's a fabulous read. And check out also the school's courses. That's how I first learned about today's presenter, from a colleague who subscribed to one of his courses. So thank you for being part of the San Francisco Public Library's Everybody's Climate series. Thank you, audience, for participating and offering your questions. Thank you to my colleague Paula Heaney, who along with me organized the series of programs. One more this Wednesday, if you live in San Francisco, performance of the Left Coast Chamber Ensemble, 6 p.m. guess that's all I have to say. Thank you, our Zoom audience. Thank you to those out in
thank you all.
YouTube land. And best of wishes for you, Ajay, and the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research.
Thank you. I
Hope to see you
appreciate it.
again in the future.
Me too. Thank you so
Take
much for
care.
having me.